The story of pasta bolognese for me, it started when I was a little line cook at Barbuto. I had taken that job and, it was just such a busy kitchen. And there was this dish that we just made a ton of, just like every other Italian restaurant, you're making a ton of bolognese. But it was this really special dish that it was the epitome of slow cooking. And it really took a long time for me to learn how to make it as well. I'm Chef Joe Chan, and this is the dish that launched my career. I'd come from Nobu, which was absolutely crazy busy all the time. We were booked to the gills, lunch and dinner. And then I'd moved over to Barbuto, where that exact same thing was happening, except that it was a slow cooking concept, which made things significantly more difficult for executing food. I worked for Jonathan, I think for a total of three and a half years. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the last line cook position I'd ever take. 6 months into it, they made me into a junior sous chef. And then about a year after that, I was running Barbuto. One of the toughest things about making bolognese at Barbuto was that you had to sort of do the prep in between all of the other things that you were doing. So you'd be really busy in the middle of a crazy lunch service, and then you'd just try to cut, 10 pounds of onions. You were also fulfilling a 200-person lunch, so it was a complete shift. It was a lot for little me to take. I knew at some point in my career that I had stepped into one of the hardest kitchens that I'd ever been in when they were doing a parsley tasting on my first day. There were so many discussions about whether or not curly parsley or flat leaf parsley was better, and that's when I realized that maybe my palate wasn't as refined as everybody else's. And we had kind of come to a consensus and a vote that curly parsley tasted just slightly better than flat leaf parsley. So since then, I've always used curly parsley in my restaurants. Bolognese comes from Bologna. It's a type of Italian meat ragu, for lack of a better way of saying it. Bolognese indicates that it's made with ground beef rather than large pieces of meat that are then shredded down. It's seen in most Italian places, and it's really seen as a staple. So doing it well is a really, really big deal. Jonathan's Bolognese was actually made by a guy named Luis. Luis was the greatest line cook ever. That's what he was known as. He'd been with Jonathan for forever, and his Bolognese was considered the absolute gold standard of what Bolognese should taste like. And it just seemed like everything that Luis touched was absolutely perfect. And the rest of us just couldn't make it to Luis's standard. We didn't have a lot of things written down at Barbuto. It sort of all went by feel. And the way that you would learn to make something like bolognese in culinary school is absolutely not the way that Luis made it. And Luis just broke absolutely every single rule. And that's when I started to realize that so much of cooking was about watching other people and learning the things about them and not necessarily seeing something in a book. Our bolognese at Barbuto was made out of beef, veal, and pork. These days, I just make it with beef and pork because it's a little bit easier to find. And a typical recipe at Barbuto was 40 pounds. So we did 20 pounds of beef, 10 pounds of veal, 10 pounds of pork. So it was pretty heavy to carry all around. The bolognese seems really, really simple to execute, but it's really about time and patience. When it comes to adding the tomato paste, you really have to let the tomato paste completely cover all the vegetables and almost come down to this brick red color and evaporate as much as water as humanly possible. I think the biggest challenge for making the bolognese for me was just the sheer size of the recipe. There was no half recipes that were ever made. It was always made full on, and we had to make 40-pound batches twice a week in order to fulfill all the orders the restaurant needed. In the process of making the bolognese and all the steps that it took to get to the point where you finally were about to add the chicken stock, you're sort of always sweating it because you didn't know if it was quite right yet. And as soon as you added the chicken stock, based on the color that came up from the bottom of the pan, that's pretty much when you knew if you had it or you didn't. And you had either made 40 pounds of beautiful bolognese or 40 pounds of just pure garbage. Pasta was always a major feat to learn because so much of it is by feel. And in New York, we'd have these really humid summers, and then we would have these really cold winters, and the pasta dough would change a little bit. And you couldn't just look at something and say this many grams of that or this many grams of that. It really was, once you had finished combining the dough, you had to have a feel for it and know whether or not it was right. When you put so much work into something like bolognese, you don't want to just grab any old, pasta off the shelf. It feels like it's that occasion. It feels special. I think fresh pasta gives you that feeling like you're a nonna somewhere. It gives you that like, yeah, I could do this super rustic in the middle of nowhere kind of thing. So it was that really sort of tactile, tangible experience of cooking where you made something with your hands all the way, and it was just very, very satisfying. Once it all comes together, it's perfect. It just gives you those warm feelings. It's perfect for that Sunday supper. It's cold outside or it's raining. It just gives you those warm, fuzzy feelings. I imagine the way that something like meatloaf gives to other people. I think when I finally got the bolognese, when I finally had nailed it and I felt like I was making it at Luis's level and sometimes maybe even just a hair better, that's when I knew I had really leveled up as a cook. I had taken everything that I had learned previously and it had culminated in this moment where all of those techniques were happening in this one dish. And the thing about bolognese is it's a really, really rustic, homely dish, but at the same time, it takes so much technique and so much work and so much patience to build the flavors that it takes to get to a great bolognese. Barbuto for me in a lot of ways was about searching for graduation day, about milking every last drop of every lesson that I could learn from it, because I knew it was a school that I wasn't going to be able to be in for very long. I think the biggest lesson that I learned at Barbuto was patience. It's like, I think one of the hardest things as a proper chef, as a proper cook to learn is to just be patient. Sometimes it just needs a little more time, and that's okay. I think, we're sort of always trying to rush, we're so busy, and I think it's important to know that patience is one of the most critical parts of cooking.